paper where there seemed to be violence or conflict going on in the world. Since then, that small-scale project has grown into a program. We're now 15 to 20 full-time employees, and we've become the world-leading provider of conflict data in the research field. The UCDP definition of armed conflict is the most used. It has become the standard in research on civil war, for instance. We also have this online encyclopedia that I want to mention. It includes conflict narratives, actor descriptions. There are charts, graphs, and maps that you can download. All the data is there. It's free of charge, and it just sits there waiting for you to explore it. So take a look at our website if you're interested. So what do we mean by armed conflict, and why do we need a definition anyway? Like, what's the use of a definition? Well, in order to be able to conduct research, we need to know that what we're looking for. We need to know that we're capturing the same phenomenon across time and space. We need data that is systematic and comparable, and a strict and clear definition is a must to be able to do this. The UCDP has this very strict definition of armed conflict that we use as a lens through which we observe what's going on in the world. We collect data on 3 different types of organized violence. The first one is what we call state-based armed conflict, and that's what we usually talk about. That's conflicts involving the state, so it's a state against another state. Those are quite rare nowadays, but more commonly states against opposition groups or rebel groups. We look at battle-related deaths, so we look at direct deaths incurred in battle. We don't take into account other types of violent deaths. There are homicide, domestic violence, structural violence in the form of lack of health care, malnutrition. I'm not saying that that's not important. It's very important when you're assessing the situation in the world and in a specific country. But there are other people doing that who are good at that. And this is what we're good at, so this is what we focus on. But it's good to keep in mind that it's direct deaths incurred in battle. We also have a requirement of the conflict being over a political incompatibility, so that the opposition organization is trying to overthrow the government or to change the status of a territory, so that they're aiming for independence or autonomy. And in Afghanistan, we find examples of this type of violence with the Afghan government fighting Taliban and IS, of course. The second category of organized violence is non-state conflicts, and here we find conflicts where the state is not involved. It can be a rebel group against another rebel group against the militia, or different ethnic groups fighting each other, or other communal groups fighting each other. In the recent years, we have conflicts in Afghanistan between the Taliban and IS, and also the Taliban fighting over the leadership. So between the Taliban main group supporting Akhundzada and the splinter faction led by Rasul. And the third category is what we call one-sided violence. And here we find governments or rebel groups or militias attacking and targeting civilians, so intentional targeting of civilians. We find massacres and genocides in this category, but also individual killings and targeting. The important thing is that civilians are the targets of these attacks. So civilians can also end up in the state-based armed conflict category. Most do. Those are civilians killed in crossfire, indiscriminate bombings, etc. But these are the ones that are targeted because of their status as civilians. All these 3 categories have a threshold for inclusion in our data. In order for us to consider a conflict being active, we need to register 25 fatalities during 1 calendar year. And these three categories then together make up what we call organized violence. And I won't go much deeper into detail on the different aspects of the definition and the UCDP methodology and sources that we use, potential bias, etc. But I'm happy to answer questions on that later if you're interested, or send me an email if there's not enough time today. So, according to the UCDP, is violence increasing or decreasing around the world? Well, it seems to me that a lot of people have the sense that violence is increasing. Now I'm talking on a global scale. We have this feeling that the world is becoming more insecure. If we look at what the data tells us, so this is from the post-Cold War time period. It starts in 1989. You can see all the three different types of violence here, but the top is the total. We can see that we've experienced a peak recently. 2014 was an extremely violent year in the sense of conflict data. We can also see that the total number of fatalities has decreased substantially since then. For 3 years now, we have seen less violence. Please also note that this y-axis is truncated to be able to show the trends but still include the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, because otherwise that would overshadow any trend that we could observe in this graph. This increase starting in 2011 is mostly due to the fighting in Syria, and the decrease seen after 2014 is also driven by the case of Syria. In this graph, I have again, the blue bars here show the total number of fatalities, so it's basically the same trend that you saw in the previous graph. I excluded Rwanda, just to be able to show the trends here, but I've also included Afghanistan, the red bars at the bottom. And now you can see that despite this overall downward trend in the number of fatalities, violence in Afghanistan has actually increased quite substantially since 2013, and it reached a new peak in 2017 with almost 20,000 fatalities in these three categories of violence that I mentioned. We also know that both in Syria and in Iraq, violence has continued to decrease this year, while it has increased in Afghanistan. So there are still a few months left of this year, but it's very, very likely that Afghanistan will be the most conflict-affected country in the world when it comes to fatalities, and that it will continue to increase in Afghanistan. The data for 2018 is still very preliminary. We usually go through the data by the end of the year, read a lot of reports that come out later, investigations into specific cases, books if they have been published, etc. So the data for 2018 is still preliminary, but that said, it won't be lower than this. So there will probably be some conflict events added to the data, but we won't remove anything that's there now. So what I've done here is to compare fatalities by month. In 2017, that's the blue, and 2018, the red. And you can see that violence, in all months except for in March, violence has been causing more fatalities in 2018 than it did in 2017. So if it continues at this rate, it's very, very likely that fatalities will be more than 20,000 this year, and that it will be a new record, new peak. This graph also shows a little bit with the increase in violence that usually takes place after the Taliban announces its spring offensive in April, May every year. You can see that violence is on a higher level during the summer months. If we look at the regional distribution of violence, this is only for 2018 data. And you can see that this is the events, all the conflict events that we have recorded. there's some, so the legend tells you a little bit like the size of the ring has to do with a number of fatalities, but the main thing here is just to show that there are very few areas that are completely free of violence. But then again, violence tend to cluster in certain areas, definitely, but there are very few areas where we have not recorded any violence, and usually we have violent events in these three categories of violence that I talked about in every province of the country. This is another way showing the same data. This is also 2018 data, and it shows the density of the violence. So this is a heat map. The more yellow the color, or red, the more violence. And you can see Ghazni that we have discussed, Nangarhar, of course, especially Achin and the violence against IS there, but also in Farah and in Kabul. Unfortunately, the capital sign is covering a bit of the heat map color in Kabul. But this is the distribution on a heat map for the violence so far in 2018. And this is the way the distribution of violence has looked for the past 10 years or so, even though violence has, like, levels have increased, but the distribution has been quite similar. It was different back in 2004, 2005. Violence was much more concentrated to the southern parts, to Helmand, Kandahar. Then it started to spread to the east, to the west, and then to the north, and for the past 10 years or so has been covering almost the entire country. Lastly, I wanted to show you what the trends look for Kabul. We've been discussing that a little bit, the security situation in Kabul, and this is a place that many governments, including the Swedish one, thinks it's safe enough for internal refugees. These are the fatalities and the development since 2013. Note that the 2018 data is missing 4 months of the year, since we're not there yet. So and it's still more than it was last year. So this will probably be an even bigger increase when we look at the full data. And Kabul also stands out as one of the few places where we register more civilian fatalities than representatives of the warring parties. Are there any questions? I also have several other maps if you're interested in specific things, but I think I'll finish there and open up for questions.
Thank you, Therese. For very interesting presentation. Okay, I see a hand there, so please give her a mic. Yes.
Thank you. This was interesting. I'd like you to comment a little more about the map on where these things actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
The next to last slide, I think.
The heat map, or the...
Yes, the heat map.
The next one is actually this one. Maybe that will give you more information. This is on the province level.
Yes, because what we could see was that in the bottom of Afghanistan, there were, in the previous map, no casualties.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because nobody lives there?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that you could also see the mountainous areas in the central parts of the country not being that conflict effective. It's that's of course one reason. I mean, why violence is concentrated to bigger cities or places where people tend to be. There is also a small, like, potential media bias in reporting events, conflict events. So we're not only relying on media reports, but that is a big source of information for us. We only rely on open sources. So it's media reports, NGO reports, etc. And especially going back in time, so in the early 1990s, for instance, we see that more violence is reported from bigger cities because there are journalists there reporting on that. It's not as big of an issue anymore because we have so much more access to information and people can report. We don't require like an AFP journalist going to a certain area to get reports coming out of there. So, but yeah.
Yes, and then as second part of my question, also nothing is seen on Bamyan,
No.
and that is still province capital.
Yeah.
So could you please comment on that?
Well, actually, Bamyan is usually one of the more like less affected provinces. There are, of course, several reasons of that. One is the more like the terrain is more difficult in the central parts in general. And also, of course, where these rebel groups. So the majority of the violence going on here is fighting between the government and the Taliban. There are several thousand fatalities in the IS conflict as well, but the majority is the Taliban. And so that, of course, also has an impact on where is the Taliban territories, their heartland. Where are they trying to get control of districts or provinces and so on?
I saw a hand there in the first, Mr. Anders Fengel. You have a question?
I'm going to be a little bit nitty-gritty here.
Of course.
You have no provincial capital for Daikundi.
No.
And then Mairanchal, which is the provincial capital for Wardak. I'm quite certain there have been some serious clashes in Wardak, but you have no heat.
So this is showing like the density of violence. So if I give you the event, that will give you a little bit more information on where there were actually violent events recorded. The other one is to show the intensity of the violence. Where are the most fatalities occurring?
That was my detailed comments. Yeah.
Okay, Helen here has a question, and then we go to gentleman there.
You were talking about 20,000 fatalities, estimated number of 20,000 in 2018. But is this about civilian fatalities? Or
No, these are all fatalities.
All fatalities.
Yeah.
Okay.
So both the security forces,
Security
police,
forces.
Local police.
Okay. And do you have any numbers of Taliban or other insurgents that are killed or injured?
Yeah, so what we do is that we go through all these reports that I mentioned, and we register every time that there is someone getting killed in organized violence, basically. So every conflict event, every clash, suicide attack, bomb, ambush, airstrike is a separate observation in our database. And there you'll find information on who did what to whom, basically. So there is information on the total number of people killed, but also the breakdown. So side A, side B, that's a government or the insurgents, civilians, and also unknown, because sometimes the reporting is not good enough to be able to determine. We also have three estimates. So the ones that I've showed you now are based on our best estimate, but we also have a low estimate and a high estimate to show the uncertainty in some or many events where there may be conflicting numbers reported, or where we may not be 100% sure of the group involved, for instance. So we focus a lot on the groups. We need to know which groups are involved. And that's part of our definition, and that's because we want to be able to do research on, for instance, if a certain group is included in the peace process, other type of characteristics that might influence the violence. So if we cannot determine what actually happened or which group was actually involved, it will not be included in our final data, or in our best estimate at least.
Therese will also participate actually in the panel discussion. So yeah, it's not mentioned in the original program, but then there's slight changes in the plan. So she will participate in the panel discussion. So if you want to have a longer coffee break, so I suggest that we have a coffee break. And then we start with our next speaker. Thank you very much, Therese.